So we're into week 2. We're going to be looking at the 2 days of Jesus's week. Last week we finished with Palm Sunday, so we're looking at Monday and Tuesday. I've kind of experimented with various titles, so it's either the Fig Tree's finale or it's Trouble Brewing. So we're looking at Monday, where we see Jesus clearing the temple, and then Tuesday, which I refer to as turnaround or sometimes troubling Tuesday, because you get a lot of conflict on Tuesday. So where am I? Oh, I need to let's come over here. Yeah. So at the end of last week, we just read, which is often a surprise, because it certainly was for me. Maybe you're all such seasoned readers of the gospel, you've seen it years and years ago. But I remember when I was it was only when I was actually starting to put together the 4 gospels that I realized that the clearing of the temple didn't happen on the same day as Palm Sunday. And we only get it from one gospel. It's just the way that the gospels kind of squeeze everything together. So we hear about Jesus going in and how people follow him with the donkey and so on. And then we hear about him going into the temple, and we assume that one follows the other, which is not an unreasonable assumption, but Mark's quite clear that Jesus spends the whole day probably riding that donkey through the crowds who are camped to the east of Jerusalem, on the Mount of Olives, and so he's riding through there, causing a huge stir. It's worthwhile noticing, you see, that of course we're so used to the fact that we know who somebody famous is because we know what they look like because of photography and everything else. But the ancient world people wouldn't. So there's a kind of but the thing would have rippled as he rides in on the donkey. There's people with him because they know the story of Lazarus. Lazarus is probably with him as well. There's a bit of a crowd starting to focus, and as the crowd starts to focus, because Jesus is there on that donkey, they all know who they're looking at. We saw at the end of last week. There's a point after Jesus has met some Greeks. And then there's been a kind of a rumble of thunder, and the disciples maybe and definitely Jesus hear that as being a declaration from heaven over Jesus and what he's about to do. And then it talks about how he slips into the crowd, and you mix that together. So he mixes into the crowd, and then he's here, Mark 11 at the end, he's entering Jerusalem now, in the temple in Jerusalem, presumably on his own, because once he's got off the donkey, it's not impossible for someone in his position now to be anonymous. It's just that we can't see it that way. If you think someone's famous, we all know who they are. So he gets there, goes in. It's now evening. He looks around. He takes store of what he sees, and he goes back to Bethany with the 12. So what we're going to see now on Monday as Jesus heads back in from Bethany is he's going to curse a fig tree, which is fruitless. I'm just going to put the events up as we go. He's going to clear the temple traders from the court of the Gentiles. Then he's going to spend the afternoon, he's going to be healing the sick, and he has a bit of a celebration in the temple. People are singing and dancing, and everything's going on. Jesus seems to be really in control of the things as the crowd's now following him in. And we're going to read about how the authorities start plotting, and that all kind of seems to coalesce around the Monday. So here I'm setting the thing up. So we know about the story, how Jesus starts walking in. He's not on the donkey this time, so he's not going to cause such an instant response. He's not going to be so instantly recognizable. Doesn't mean to say he's going to get into Jerusalem with no crowds, as we see he will, but it won't be quite as big and as tumultuous as the day before. And as they're going, there's a fig tree, and fig trees. This was always one of those kind of confusing things. It seems a bit unkind. It wasn't the season for fruit, and Jesus goes over and there's nothing to eat on it and seems to get annoyed and curses it. It's only when you discover that fig trees have a really unusual ripening pattern. And because they actually use wasp larvae to kind of actually kick off the ripening process. And so during a season, there's little buds appear. Not all of them will ripen because they don't get to the transfer. And some of them will just get, they'll get, I don't know what the right word is for it, but they get triggered by the wasps. But as the autumn is coming, the buds start to grow, but they never fully develop. And so they go dormant. And then when the next spring comes around, and this is spring, so spring has now come, those kind of those buds that have been dormant for a year will become edible. They don't grow into full-blown figs, but they become little edible buds. sweet enough to eat, and so on. So what Jesus is looking for is the spring. See if there are any of those buds on the tree. But there are none there. So we're going to see on the Tuesday, Jesus is going to refer back when he's preaching the what we think of as the apocalyptic sermon. When he's sitting on the Mount of Olives looking back over the temple, he talks about the fig tree and says, remember the parable of the fig tree. And so this is all part of the mix. So if we read the text, that we pulled it all together, so we find that it both recorded in Matthew and in Mark. So now on the next day, just a reminder again, if it's in blue, it's from Mark. If it's in purple, you can just about see it's purple, it's from Matthew. And if it's in black, it's from both of them. You find the words in both of them. So now the next day, when they'd come out from Bethany in the morning, as he returned to the city, he was hungry. Seeing a fig tree far off by the road, having leaves, he came to it. See, the having leaves is a meaning spring's kicked in and the leaves have started to grow again. To see if perhaps he might find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing on it but leaves, because it wasn't for it was not the season for figs. Which doesn't mean to say in the spring there shouldn't be something edible on a fig tree, see. And Jesus said to it, or told to it, let there be no fruit from you forever. May no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples heard it, and immediately the fig tree withered away. So there are a couple of things to throw in on the mix. I put the date up there. If you remember last week when we looked at the calendars, if we're working with a crucifixion date of 33 AD, this is the 30th of March. I quite like the fact that we can actually trace the days. It kind of feels good if you know someone whose birthday is on one of these days. It's good the way it kind of locks into your memory. As I say, you will often find Jesus is criticised. I've heard from serious-minded agnostic Jewish scholarship and so on, who say it's a bit petulant, just kind of. But actually, there's something of a symbolism going on here. So it's not purely, I didn't get what I wanted, so I'm so annoyed I cursed the fig tree. Because as I said, that's why I highlighted. We'll see in the afternoon, the day after, there's something about the fig tree that is supposed to speak symbolically. It's to speak prophetically. It's to challenge and make the disciples think. So we read that last little line, immediately the fig tree withered away. And in our Western mindset, as I said, is the way we think. We think of immediate as kind of, hey, presto. Whereas you find regularly in the Gospels, immediately can sometimes be several months. What it really means is there's a kind of direct connection from Jesus saying it to it actually happening. So immediately the fig tree withered away. And just to kind of understand the sort of the role of the symbolism, I'm going to include vines as we do, because they appear together, fig trees and vines. And actually we're going to find over the next couple of days an awful lot of conversation about fig trees and vines. So that it's more than just incidental. The gospel writers have chosen to include it because it creates a balance when Jesus is going to tell several parables about vineyards as well. So vines and fig trees are a kind of a sign of security and blessing. So I've given you some examples. You've got 1 Kings, Micah, you've got Zechariah. You get things like this. Judah and Israel lived safely, every man under his vine and under his fig tree. And so actually some of these verses are probably part of the conversation Jesus has with Philip when he says, I saw you under the fig tree when you're sitting under the fig tree. If you look and you find the context, there is messianic thinking that is associated with this idea of the vine and the fig tree, which is in the age of peace. So in particular, I think in 1 Kings, I think is it 1? No, that would be 2 Kings. Oh yeah, under his fig tree, all the days of Solomon. There we go, all the days of Solomon. It is under Solomon. So Solomon, of course, is the son of David, who is our peace. Solomon, the actual word comes from shalom, which is the peace. It's actually the same. It's the name version of the word you use for the peace offering. So Solomon kind of stands as a model of the son of David who's going to come as a peace offering. He's not the same as the King David. He kind of reigns more like an emperor. He reigns in peace. He's not fighting battles. David has come as a king who has to fight battles. So in that sense, he kind of looks at that messianic age where peace has now come And there's something about sitting under your vine and under your fig tree, which is a sign of the thing that is a bit more messianic. But equally, the counter side of that is when the two are fruitless, when vines and fig trees are fruitless, they're often a sign of judgment. So that in Jeremiah, we've got I'll utterly consume them, says Yahweh. No grapes shall be on the vine, nor figs on the fig tree, and the things I've given them shall pass away from them. And Jeremiah, of course, is prophesying the terrible events that are going to come in with the Babylonians who are besieging Judea, and people are being carried away in exile. And Jerusalem is being destroyed. And in that context, we see that actually one of the markers of that is the lack of fruit on those two things. And so some of that is kind of being brought into the story, even as we're kind of reading through it. If there's a little bit of a confusion if you read Matthew's Gospel and you compare it, say, with Mark or Luke. So I've just got a quick comment on how you harmonise them. If you're reading Matthew's Gospel, we read about Jesus riding in on the donkey. We read about him clearing the money changers, clearing the temple, and then we read about now in the morning when he was going in, how he curses the fig tree, and immediately it happens, and Jesus explains it all. And because of the way our minds are so chronologically driven, it's just by the culture we've grown up in, we tend to see them as sequential events. But actually, what Matthew actually does is he tells us four different stories. And the way you put them all together, you can see they are all happening in the same general space, but they don't have to be understood sequentially. So the difference is in Mark, you got a very clear sense of the next morning. So it's the next morning. Matthew is just something about in the morning, and then he covers 2 days events in one thing. So we blend the two together. It's not impossible to do. I won't try and be too boring with you at the moment. I say boring. It's probably not the. I think I'm just going to make. There we go. Let's get rid of that line at the top. I just recognise that you can get very bogged down if you try and do it while you're kind of teaching with some enthusiasm. So I'm saying if you can go and look at it for yourself, but it's not impossible. You can see how they spread out. So there's something being set up, and we'll finish the story when we get to the second part. But for the time being, Jesus sees the event. He sees the fig tree. He goes over looking for fruit. It wouldn't be this season's, but it would be the hangover from last year, which is, as the spring has come, has now become edible. It's not there to eat. But in cursing it, he's setting up a sign. And then they continue on towards the temple. So people are waiting and they're expecting as he walks. It's the 2 miles. You're going to get a bit of a crowd with him. It's probably smaller than the day before, for the simple reason that people aren't instantly recognising him, and he's now on foot. He's not riding the donkey. But he gets a bit of a crowd heading in with him. So we then read, so when he come to Jerusalem, all the city was stirred up, saying, "Who's this?" The multitude saying, "This is Jesus. This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee." And Jesus, or he, entered into the temple of God and began to drive out or throw out those who sold and bought in the temple. And he overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he wouldn't allow anyone to carry a container. I haven't actually highlighted it, but we'll touch on that because that's one of those weird statements. What on earth is that about? Wouldn't allow anyone to carry a container through the temple. And so he taught them, saying, "Is it or isn't it written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you've made it a den of robbers." And so again, we have Jesus is drawing by explicit reference, my house will be called a house of prayer, you've made it a den of robbers. These are very specific quotes from the Old Testament that drag some prophetic context into what's going on. But the story is actually quite is actually really, really significant to the understanding of the mission of Jesus. By which I mean, we don't have to understand its meaning to kind of get hold of the idea that Jesus has died in a way that satisfies something about the righteousness of God and our fallenness and our brokenness and so on. We can latch onto that without understanding this, but as you start to see the significance of it and the opening up of the worship of the Creator God, Yahweh, to the whole of humanity, and we find that actually God has set up things like the temple and trading and other things in the Old Testament as being kind of key elements of understanding. So one of the things just to flag is, of course, this isn't the first time Jesus has cleared out the temple. In John's Gospel, we read about how he does it right at the beginning of his ministry. I'm tempted to say he does it before the public side of his ministry. By that I mean before he starts to itinerate with a team around Galilee. John, of course, starts Jesus' ministry with the wedding of Cana. So it's kind of public, but it's not big scale public. It's kind of like, if you take it in modern terms, Jesus is leading locally. Maybe he goes to a few other kind of local churches. He goes to a few other synagogues, but he's not become a big, well-known TV ministry. You know what I'm saying. But he has in that early phase. So if you look at it like that, Jesus starts his ministry by clearing out the temple, and he concludes his ministry by clearing out the temple. There's something about his ministry that is undermining the place of the temple. He himself becomes the dwelling place. The life of God is in him, not in a building made by hands anymore. And in the doing of that, it's going to open up the worship of Yahweh to the whole of humanity. So it's clearly this important part of Jesus' message. And he's not the only person who saw it. When Jesus clears out the temple, it's impossible to say whether he's the first person to do it or not. But by the time Jerusalem is destroyed, and I doubt he's the first person. That's not to take anything away from it, but I'll explain. We read just before Jerusalem is finally destroyed, and then after it's destroyed in the rabbinic writings, that actually lots of pilgrims are really, really not happy with the trading that goes on in the temple. And actually we read in John's account at the beginning of Jesus' ministry how the temple guard comes. And actually we're told in the rabbinic writings how they carry sticks with them so people who get a bit difficult they don't like the trading, get a bit difficult, maybe kind of aren't going with it properly and kicking off. They slap them around with their sticks and chuck them out of the temple, which is effectively what happens to Jesus, because he's a nobody. He's not famous. He's just a hot-headed kind of preacher who's come up from Galilee. He doesn't like what's going on in the temple. He turns over the money tables. The temple guard come out, threaten him or maybe hit him with a stick or two, chuck him out of the temple, and he ministers outside of the temple and the kind of road that runs up to it. Now, of course, that's not so possible. Because, of course, Jesus has a bigger crowd with him now. Again, to give it its historical context, we're going to meet Annas in Jesus' trial. So he is, I call him the effective high priest. There are two high priests in Jesus' day, because Annas was made high priest when the Romans took over Judea as a direct governorship. So it stopped being an independent vassal kingdom under Herod the Great. After Herod died, his kingdom was broken into 4 sections. His son Archelaus made such a lousy job of running Judea that the Romans took it away from him and brought in a governor. So when that happened, they made Annas the effective high priest, or the high priest. But then the next governor came along, a guy called Gratus. And Gratus didn't like him because Annas was an incredibly political savvy, probably very worldly wise, if you think of it like that. Gratus didn't trust him, so he got rid of him. He sacked him. But there is a problem with that, because as far as the Romans are concerned, they can do that. As far as the Old Testament is concerned, high priest is high priest for life. So you got this standoff situation where there is a high priest who is still a high priest. But he's not allowed to actually run the thing. And so he becomes the sort of, he's the power behind the throne. So he becomes he remains the high priest until his death, which is about, I think, in 62 AD. He remains the kind of spiritual force behind the role, or the political, perhaps is a better way rather than spiritual, while his sons carry out the kind of functional officiating with the kind of day-by-day title. So so he and his family remain dominant and wealthy right the way up till Jerusalem's destruction. He's died by then, but the family is still wealthy. And they gained the way they actually gained their wealth was by the absolutely cool-headed exploitation of the principles and by commercializing the temple and the feasts. which is, of course, the reason for all these traders in the temple. Now, he's got a son-in-law who's currently the acting high priest. He's the official high priest. So he chairs the Sanhedrin and so on. But all major decisions are really made by Annas, who's a much more powerful, significant figure. You find that in the rabbinic writings. He's not actually Caiaphas' son, he's his son-in-law. But he and his brothers-in-law continue the market system, and they're in charge right the way up to the destruction of the temple. So that the markets themselves actually become known as the Bazaars of the sons of Annas. So you kind of get the context. And you find them written about in the Talmuds and the various other rabbinic writings. Here's a little kind of it's a poem. It's a longer poem, but it's got these lines: "Woe to the house of Annas! Woe to the serpent's hiss! They are high priests." Okay, so they are high priests. You've got to recognise that. Their sons are keepers of the treasury. Okay, so you got their high priests, and their sons are in all the positions where there's money coming in. Their sons-in-law are guardians of the temple. Okay, well, sons-in-law, Caiaphas has done even better. He's actually now a high priest as well. And their servants beat the people with staves. And that little phrase, servants, it probably means the kind of less mature members of the family, still extended family. Because what we know is that the temple guard are all themselves priests, and they're all connected by the familial connections to Annas' family. So it's really like a mafia set, if I can say it in a kind of in a way that we can kind of get our heads around. The lesser players are those who guard the temple and kind of beat people up with their sticks if they're misbehaving and complaining about the way the system works. The more immediate, closer sons are there in significant positions where they're going to make money because they're handling the money that the temple is producing. There are plenty of other insults about them we could have chosen, and we could go on all night. So what I'm really getting across is there is something very corrupt. Jesus fits within a flow of challenging that. He starts his ministry by trying to do something about it, challenging it. Probably not the first, because already the temple guard know how to deal with people like him. But when it comes to the final occasion, it's a very different situation, because now he has this big crowd of people. A little bit more. The actual temple markets operate as you run up to the temple on the Mount of Olives. And it's mainly in the feast seasons that then they open up the markets inside the temple itself. And basically, you needed, it was kind of a franchise system, and you couldn't operate there without paying money to the temple. And when you sold an animal, you had to give a cut to the temple. The temple always historically used to live on offerings of meat from the sacrifices, but now it's all become very commercial. As you go into the temple, you can jump the queue by buying an animal in the temple rather than buying it further out and having to drag it in. You can get to the front of the queue if you could buy one, but of course they're a lot more expensive. So they're often being sold at kind of 10 times their real value. And with kind of maybe around 1 million people coming through for a big feast like Passover, you can see how the money kind of starts adding up very quickly. Then in addition, you have the money changers. They're there because if you're trading in the temple, you can't use foreign money, which has got maybe kind of things on it that is considered blasphemous. They had settled about 100 or so years before on accepting the shekels as they were minted in Tyre, so Tyrian shekels. But what happened is that Tyrian shekels stopped being minted, not stopped being produced, so they became quite rare. So they actually became more valuable than the amount of silver that was in them. But as a result, what they said is these are the only ones that are actually acceptable for trading within the temple and making your offerings, or for paying the temple tax in. So the temple tax, again, was another scam. Sorry, you might find this is boring, but you think the world never changes, that everyone was supposed to pay the temple tax according to the law of Moses. But the Sadducees had decided that they should pay it every year. That's how you should interpret what the law said. The law said you should pay it, and we think it means annually. The Essenes refused to pay the temple tax, and so there were a lot of people who said, no, it's a one-off. Once you paid it once, you don't have to pay it anymore. It's just something you do once in your life. So when Jesus is asked that question, do you and your disciples pay the temple tax? It's not because quite a lot of people didn't, and that was their argument. This should be a once-off thing, and but it kind of created all sorts of extra hassles for you because they kept records of who had paid it and who hadn't. If you wanted to offer at the temple at all, you had to be up to date with your temple tax, you see. And that had to be paid in the right currency, which was now a coin that had less silver in it than was actually worth. And so there was these exorbitant exchange rates going on. So you can see the family became exceptionally wealthy. It was a unique way of doing business in the ancient Jewish world. Pardon me. So I'm going to have a drink of something because my throat's So Jesus comes into that context, and that's what he clears out. So when he came into Jerusalem, all the city was stirred up, and they're saying, "Who's this?" And the multitude, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. He entered the temple." Oh yeah, so we read this. I think I'll just put it up again with that quote, just to remind you before we move on. So let's just unpack a little bit more the full kind of prophetic context of what Jesus is doing as he clears out the traders. So we're going to look at in a minute. There's a verse in Haggai which makes a reference to the wealth of nations. There's a verse in Zechariah which talks about no more trading in Yahweh's house. You see all of these kind of relevant. Bits in Isaiah about the house of prayer for all nations. And there's also the bit that Jesus has quoted about a den of robbers from Jeremiah. So just have a quick look at some of these things. So the Haggai one, which I always think is fascinating, says, "I'll shake all the nations, and the wealth," and I put a little slash, "that the wealth or the desire of nations will come. And I'll fill this house with glory, says Yahweh of hosts." And I put there, note the conflict. The conflict is, what should we translate that word in yellow as? The wealth stroke desire of nations. So here you go. Here's a little kind of Bible dictionary for it. The Chemdar. It literally, it's singular, and it means something that's precious. So the English translators have looked at it and said, so it's singular, something that's precious, that's singular. Wealth is a singular noun. We don't talk about wealths in plural. If you talk about riches, that would be a bit misleading because so we think maybe it's because it's precious, it's wealth. And others say no, but you can also use it to mean something that's precious. It's something, so it's the desire of it, something you desire, it's something I value hugely. And so the actual word could be either of those things. So there's a kind of a conflict in how you interpret it. Because the wealth of nations, if you interpret it that way, it would imply, which is probably the way the priests are interpreting it, that people come from all over the world with their wealth. They have to trade their wealth for small bits of silver that aren't worth as much as the gold they have to spend on them, but that allows them to participate in the feasts, and without it they can't. So all this gold is coming in, and then the temple collects the gold, melts it all down, puts it... it coats the outside there's gold all over the place, gold and silver, and so suddenly the building is being built up using all this gold and silver that comes from the wealth of nations who have been bringing it into exchange and use at the temple, and that's its glory. It's this incredible, sumptuous building, kind of one of the great wonders of the world, the ancient world, with covered in gold and silver and so on, and marble. Which has all come in through this kind of trading process. So in one sense, the priests probably sit there looking and saying, see, we're fulfilling that prophecy now. Look what's happened to this temple. It's moved from the days of Ezra, where it was kind of a small thing, didn't seem as good as it used to be. And now look how big it is. It's never been bigger. It's never had more riches put to it. And they've all come in by the trading of the nations coming in, bringing their wealth with them. Whereas if you translate it as the desire of nations, it implies that there's something there in the temple which is desired and valuable to every single person on earth. All of the nations of the world actually value this. You see the kind of turnaround, and it is one of those things which we have to be realistic about, which is often the way that prophecy works. Is it has a little bit of deliberate ambiguity in it, because it's not just truth; it's truth that somehow it kind of discerns the heart of the person who's reading it. Just even the way they kind of see it and apprehend it. So it's not just declaring truth, it's declaring truth in a way that somehow divides sheep from goats. It kind of puts you on one side or the other. How do you read this as you approach it? So those things are all there in Haggai. And obviously, as we look at it like that, the high priest view, wealth coming in, the New Testament view is very clear that Jesus is the desire of nations. He is the thing that actually it can be valued by every nation on earth, not just his own family, the people of Judea, the wider people of Israel and Samaria that were once also part of that family. Not just for them, but for every person, all peoples. And then the verse in Zechariah, to kind of add the layer from Zechariah, on that day there will be no trader, I've given you a slash again, a trader or Canaanite in the house of Yahweh who rules over all. So that day again, we're talking about Messianic period, the Messianic age. And again, to kind of understand it, if you look, here's the definition from a Bible dictionary of the word there, trader and Canaanite, the Canaanite, or Canaanite, the Canaanite, sorry, which as a nationality is the Canaanites. But actually, you can see it by implication, it's often translated, and across the ancient world, it means a peddler or a merchant. And because that's how the Canaanites made their money. So that's why they were Canaanites. They were traders. So you can actually translate the word as trader or Canaanite. You see, again, you've got this interesting... So when you see the word trader in there, suddenly it seems very relevant to what's going on with Jesus. Because there's trading going on in the house and he's clearing it out. Well, it shouldn't be there. It's blocking the sense of what God wants to do, where he wants to take the temple, where he wants to make it a place of prayer for all nations to come up to. And actually, where are the traders trading? They're actually in the court of the Gentiles. So the one area of the temple where the Gentiles can currently come is that actually all they're seeing is an absolute commercial rip-off kind of activity, selling them things that they don't really need for reasons they don't really get their heads around. And that's their kind of presenting itself. That's all they know of the temple. So there you go. I've just highlighted the, you can see it in red. I can actually, oops, hang on, just gone the wrong way. There we go. I can also look, I can get rid of me so you can see it nice and big there. I've got all these little buttons, but I forget to push them so I can get the different views. I'll come back. So anyway, yeah, so Zechariah's prophecy actually, I say continues. I think it's actually, all the nations shall come against Jerusalem. Okay. So remember last week we saw how the riding in on the donkey when it's prophesied in Zechariah is in contrast with Alexander the Great, who actually comes up against Jerusalem but doesn't destroy it. He goes and make an offering in the temple. So all the nations that came against Jerusalem, well, who's come against Jerusalem recently? Well, Alexander the Great did. He was a Greek. Will go up from year to year to worship the king. Well, remember on Palm Sunday, Jesus has a conversation with some Greeks who want to come to him because he is the desire of nations. They've sought him out. They've gone and asked Philip, and Philip goes and talks to Thomas, and Thomas introduces these Greeks to Jesus. And you can't help but see there's almost something of the way in which that triggers Jesus, although that's a word we use kind of in a not so helpful way, but it prompts him to recognize when he goes in at the end of that evening and looks around and sees the market stalls in place, that something about them as being held out. And what's dominating the court of the Gentiles are these traders, and there's that verses in Zechariah that say you shouldn't be there. So all the nations that came against Jerusalem, the Greeks have been against them, they came to fight against them, will go up year to year to worship the king, exactly as they have done. Yahweh of armies, yes, every pot in Jerusalem and in Judea will be holy. You remember I said that strange verse in Mark that said he wouldn't let anyone carry a container through. And we don't know 100% the context. We know something of the context, but we have to fill in the rest via inference. Because the prophecy goes on that on that day there will no longer be a trader in Canaan, i.e. a Canaanite, in the house of Yahweh who rules over all. And part of that there not being any there is there's something about any old pot is now considered holy. Well, when you offer your offerings, you do so in pots. So it's very likely that there was something about the pots that were being used that having to be hired, you couldn't even bring your own pot in, if that makes sense, to offer your thing. And so actually what Jesus is doing when it says he wouldn't let people carry containers through, is he's actually preventing something of this making money. You've got to do it in the right pot as well. So there's probably another element there. So you can see, as I say, this is now hitting right at the heart of this massive money-making scheme, which is a very politically worked in. Annas knows how to deal with governors and emperors. His family have been kingmakers, not just in Jerusalem but in the neighbouring nations as well for generations. You've got this kind of very sophisticated money-making system, which is unique. Well, the only way of making money this way, incredibly valued. It's being turned over by someone who this time they can't deal with like they did in the early days. Hit him with a few sticks and chuck him out. So, of course, not surprisingly, so what have I got here? Yeah. Oh, yeah, so that's right. Zechariah has already prophesied about Alexander. Yeah, I've just said that. Coming against Jerusalem at the same time as Israel's king comes in on a donkey. That was chapter 9. See, in chapter 9 is Alexander and the king coming in on a donkey, and then we've got this thing about them. Those nations that came up against us will now come to worship. In Isaiah, where he quotes, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations," you see also the foreigners again, who join themselves to Yahweh. There's something here of those who now, the pressing in of the worship of the whole world into the creative God of the people of Israel, who's been their familial God, their national God, but actually they've always known him in that context as the God of creation, the God of the whole world. But it's just been difficult to live in the tension of that, and now that revelation is coming through here. And so these burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. They're burnt offerings and sacrifices. Well, they're not at the moment. They can't physically in this one. For my house will be called a house of prayer. So now we're moving just from the practical to the more prophetic, because something has to change in the temple to fulfill this. Because at the moment they're restricted to the court of Gentiles. They can't actually come in and make their offerings in the temple itself. So now it's going beyond just the practical. Now it's hitting on something. There must be something transformational that needs to happen with this building, with the temple. So just to give you, fill out the final part, the den of robbers from Jeremiah. Don't trust in lying words, says Yahweh, saying Yahweh's temple, Yahweh's temple, Yahweh's temple. In other words, we're making a big old thing about Yahweh's temple. But the context here is that you can say that if you don't oppress foreigners, the fatherless and the widow. Now, I've highlighted foreigners and I've highlighted widow because we're going to see a widow in the temple later this morning, the widow with her mite, of course. Who become part of the mix. But you can see why there's something of these things in view, because Jesus quotes it. Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers? So you think you've got a big thing with this temple, but actually it's going to go wrong if you start to oppress foreigners and the widows and the fatherless, etc. And has this house, which is called by my name, it's now become a den of robbers? Behold, even I have seen it, says Yahweh. And that in Jeremiah is part of a warning of destruction, which is going to creep into the narrative for tomorrow. I say tomorrow, I mean Tuesday. So we're on Monday at the moment. It's going to become part of the narrative. Is something's gone wrong with the temple. There's something destructive coming to this temple. Some of it is because of practical evil and abuse, but some of it is because it was inadequate in the way it was set up. So actually, for all peoples to be able to worship, something needs to change about it. And then Jeremiah goes on to say, now go to the place which was in Shiloh, because before the temple was built, the tabernacle had stood for 400 years in Shiloh, and see what I did to that for the wickedness of my people. So I will do to the house which is called by my name. So actually, right in the phrase that flows directly on, that's verse 12, and he had up to verse 11. Den of robbers, verse 11. And I will destroy it and don't just trust in it because it's the temple. Remember, it used to be in Shiloh and it's not there anymore. You can go and have a look. It's all been pulled down. and actually pagans live there now. The Samaritans live there, in which you trust in the place in which I give to your fathers, as I did in Shiloh. So you can see that, if you like, something of the temple's destruction is becoming into focus. It becomes more so tomorrow, but it's already there just in the way Jesus is acting. But as I say, unlike the first time when the temple guards are able to clear Jesus out, Jesus now has a crowd with him. And so the guards aren't able to do anything. So Jesus kind of really owns the situation. The authorities are kind of there watching in. And while they're watching in and fulminating, Jesus ends up healing the blind and the lame. Children start to sing, and they start singing, "He's the Son of David," which offends some people. Jesus quotes Psalm 8, but he does say in a way where he puts himself in God's role, which offends more people. And the priests start plotting. And there's more than 2 days now before his arrest. So a couple of days before his arrest, they're already plotting. So the plotting begins. So we read that, "So the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things he did, and the children who were crying in the temple and saying, 'Hosanna to the Son of David,' they were indignant. So don't you hear what they're saying?" And Jesus said to them, "Yes. Did you never read, out of the mouths of babes and nursing babies, you have perfected praise." It's a slightly strange translation of the verse if you go and look at it in Psalm 8. But it's totally doable if you think of it going through from classical Hebrew to Aramaic into Greek. It can get to the way we have it reported there in the New Testament. But the Psalm 8 actually says, "Yahweh the Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. Who set your glory above the heavens? From the lips of babes and infants you've established strength," or perfected praise. And there, the praise that's being sung is directly to God. And part of the objection that the priests have had, because they're singing Hosanna to the Son of David. So they're singing to him, and he's now made this reference to it being praise. But you go and look at that verse, and it very clear, specifically is praise with it, which is focused towards a divine character. It's to the Lord. It's to the Lord. So there's something of Jesus' divinity that is being kind of tussled with in the language and the text. So you can understand how unhappy it makes the priests. Just a flag, because obviously we're just looking at the run up to Easter. Jesus has all of the last year of his life. Jesus totally he takes all of the big pilgrim feasts and turns them so that they're actually about him. So this isn't the first one he's done. He's done it at the Feast of Tabernacles, and people wanted to do something to him at that point. Now here he is doing it again. So the chief priests and the scribes, they heard it and sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him because of the multitude, was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, he left them and went out of the city to Bethany, and he lodged there. And then the way Luke puts it, we've got a kind of a bit of a summary of the whole process. He was teaching daily in the temple. Chief priests and the scribes and the leading men among the people sought to destroy him, but they couldn't find what they might do, for all the people hung on to every word that he said. So Monday evening, Jesus is back in Bethany. So we read, and you can see this is nice, we've got three different colours, three gospels.